Alright, so chapter 12, section 2 and 3, we're going to try to squeeze in two sections today into one video about the Mongols. So to understand what's going on in Mongolia, we have to understand their physical geography. It's an area with extreme temperatures. We're talking about highs of 35 and lows of negative 50 degrees. To give you an idea of how extreme this is, when you look at the winter time in Russia, it's like about negative 10, negative 20 in most cities there. So it's much colder in Mongolia in the winter. And at the same time, the summers, if you look at the summers, say in Tanzania, Kenya, Brazil, places that people might kind of consider to have hot summers, those places are still under 35 degrees. So we're talking about very, very extreme variety of temperatures. This leads towards the next point, that most of the Mongols were nomadic people. So they would move from one place to another, and they would take their animals with them, and they would feed their animals, where they could find food. Now, this type of lifestyle was not the most conducive towards a peace. In fact, because so many Mongolians were moving from one place to another, wars and battles were not uncommon between tribes who are trying to settle in the same territory. Now, perhaps the most famous Mongolian ever is Genghis Khan. He was born with the name Temujin, but eventually changes his name to Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, and he would go on to rule not only a large part of Asia, but a large part of the world as the Mongolian Empire. So his earliest conquests begin when he invades the Jin Empire, so the empire that was slightly north to the Song, and eventually he'd go on to invade the Song, he'd eventually move on to invade the Muslim territories, and even parts of what would be modern Europe today. As you can see here, by 1279, he had the largest contiguous empire we've ever seen in history. I mean, that is just enormous. It's modern day Russia, Afghanistan, Iran, Mongolia, obviously Russia. All of these territories, even that northern tip there of India, was controlled by the Mongols. Now, while we're on this topic of empires, I thought it'd be interesting to look at various empires throughout history and sort of consider this concept. What makes an empire an empire? What were the largest empires in history? So one way we can look at empires is by looking at what percent of the world was part of that empire during its time. And as you can see, for a lot of history, the various empires of China, whether it's the Tang or the Song, had quite a bit of control over the world. But you also see the Roman Empire, right, at one point controls more than a quarter of the world, or the Mongols that we're talking about right now, they did control about a quarter of the world's population at their peak. And in modern history, in the 1930s, you have the British Empire that controlled 23%, which you can see, because the world is much bigger then, is actually, if you're just looking at numbers, a very, very big 460 million. Right? We're talking about roughly 4 times the number of people the Mongols controlled. Now, another way to look at empires throughout history would be looking at simply the amount of land that's controlled. So you can see clearly in that case, the British controlled the most land in comparison to any other empire throughout history. And in that case, the Mongols actually jump up to second place. Right? They controlled 24 million kilometers at their peak. Sorry, a million kilometers squared at their peak. Now, one that's not really mentioned is the United States of America, because it's not really officially an empire, but when you look at the amount of control the U.S. has over most countries around the world today, some would argue the United States is perhaps the largest empire that has ever existed in the history of the world. Now, who was this Genghis Khan? Well, I broke it down to 3 big things when you look at him. One is his ability to organize. And really 1 and 2 sort of come as a couple. He was a brilliant strategist. He knew how to lure enemies in. He knew how to use PR. Right? He knew how to make people basically forfeit the battles even before the fights by making his enemies see how cruel and vicious the Mongolian Empire was. And that connects to 3. His cruelty was quite intense. Historians cite the Mongolian Empire and their army to be something closer to hunters than fighting military versus military. When they go into these cities and villages, they would basically kill people just the way hunters would hunt animals. And they would leave no one left alive. They would just slaughter entire villages at once. So these Mongolian soldiers were incredibly tough. If they lacked food, for example, they would just drink a little bit of blood out of the horse. They were also able to cover an incredible amount of land. We're talking about 120 miles a day. And one final note on the Mongolians: despite the fact that there were these major negative elements of their ruling, such as their cruelty and harshness, they were, however, very tolerant once groups agreed to live under Mongolian rule. For example, they allowed freedom of religion, which is very unusual for any empire throughout history, where once they conquered you, they were like, okay, as long as you agree that you're part of this empire and you agree to not rebel against us, you can practice any religion you want. Now, perhaps the next most famous Mongolian is Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who took over from 1260. Now, Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty is a little bit confusing because some people cite the Yuan dynasty as being a Chinese dynasty, others cite it as being Mongolian. And really, there's some truth to both statements. It is Chinese in the sense that, as you can see, the territory it's covering is very much similar to the Tang and the Song that we looked at in previous sections. But at the same time, obviously Kublai Khan does not really consider himself Chinese, being the grandson of Genghis Khan. So he would very much consider this Yuan dynasty as being Mongolian and not Chinese. Now, under Kublai, the Mongols saw much success. They helped build grand canals, major roads were built. Foreign trade, in fact, increased during this period. And what's very symbolic of this increase in trade is perhaps the most famous merchant or trader, Marco Polo. So Marco Polo's story goes that he traveled to the Yuan dynasty and there he served the Kublai Khan's court for over a decade. Now, Marco Polo's story is not only very unique and original, but perhaps some would say not true. And the reason why there's some accusations that the story may not be entirely true is because it's not like Marco Polo wrote down his own stories. In fact, he was captured, and when he was in prison, he told his prison mate about these stories, and his prison mate wrote about these stories, and that's how we know about Marco Polo. Now, others would argue that because of the details he mentions in his books about the Yuan dynasty, that perhaps only those who were there at the time would know. Some people say those are some facts that perhaps back up that Marco Polo was real and his story is real, and like a lot of things in history, we'll never know. Now, ultimately, internal and external forces led towards the demise of the Mongols. So from the outside, we saw numerous unsuccessful battles. So despite being able to conquer so much land, the Yuan dynasty, or the Mongols, eventually begin to stop as they fail to conquer Japan twice, they fail to conquer parts of Southeast Asia, and this failures lead towards a major depletion of resources, major depletion in morale, and it just showed that the Mongols were perhaps not as strong as they once thought they were. Now, internally, their high taxes, especially on the Chinese, were angering the Chinese, which led towards revolts. Perhaps the most important, and this is a pattern you probably noticed by now, is the lack of a strong successor. So Genghis Khan did great, Kublai Khan did great, but there was really no one else to take over after them that had the same kind of charisma, organization, strategy, and vision that these guys had. And as a result, once Khan died, there was a power struggle in 1294, which led towards riots and eventually an overall overthrow of the Mongols. Now, fun facts about Genghis Khan. So there's this legend about the tomb of Genghis Khan, which is a very fun story because the story goes that when he was buried, those who buried him were killed by his soldiers, and then their soldiers killed themselves. That's why we have no idea where Genghis Khan is buried to this day. Now, people predict it's somewhere near the Onan River, but we're not exactly sure why. Now, what was the legacy of the Mongols? Well, they helped reinvigorate, they helped reestablish strong trading between Europe and Asia. They created this delivery system known as the Yam system. The Yam system was critical to success because it helped make sure that the trade stays safe and that the correct costs and expenses were being paid. They had a tolerance towards religions, which is very unique. Their brutality lives on in infamy. And finally, they didn't really leave any architecture, which is very interesting. We saw the Byzantine Empire leave the Hagia Sophia. We saw legacies of various Middle Ages architecture still around today. But when it comes to the Mongols, because they were nomadic, they didn't really leave any notable architecture. Now finally, we jump to 2018. What's going on in Mongolia today? Well, their capital is Ulaanbaatar, which is also the coldest capital city in the world. It's a huge country in regards to size. In fact, you could fit South Korea inside of Mongolia 15 times. Buddhism is their major religion. And when it comes to their economy, they're not quite on the wealthy end. The average person only makes about $4,000 or about $350 a month. And in regards to the economy, that's about equal to places like Vietnam, Laos, or Ghana. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.